The way in getting a global response on how to deal with the recession. Jo Coburn, BBC News, Westminster.
Well, as you saw there, Gordon Brown is currently in Brussels, where an EU summit on the economic crisis threatens to be overshadowed by a row over French protectionism. The car maker Renault has hinted it may shift production from Slovenia to create 400 new jobs in France. The European Commission says it's seeking urgent clarification on this. Well, Dominic Hughes is in Brussels for us. Just explain what's at the heart of this row then, Dominic.
Well, as you say, this relates to an announcement by Renault that 400 jobs were going to be created at a Renault plant in France. A French minister speaking in Paris seemed to imply that these jobs were being repatriated from a plant in Slovakia. Now, that would not only break the terms under which French won approval from the European Commission for a bailout of their car company, it would also break the EU's internal market rules on competition. And it's cast a shadow over this summit, really, that was called to agree a position ahead of the G20 in London in 2 weeks' time, where they wanted to, for example, fix agreement on how much money they were going to offer to loan to the IMF and reform of the IMF. They were going to talk about the regulation of the banking industry, hedge funds and things like that, and also talk about protectionism as well. And that was something Gordon Brown focused on in his press conference in the last few minutes.
We reinforced our commitment to free trade. We called for more rigorous World Trade Organization monitoring of what is happening. And beyond that, we need, as we agreed, a globally coordinated expansion of trade finance led by a strong European contribution. We must remain vigilant at all times to any form of protectionism, covert or open.
Now, the European Commission has said it's going to look into this French deal, and the French President Nicolas Sarkozy, also speaking at his press conference in the last few minutes, has also tried to row back, I think. He's made clear that these jobs in France will not cost any jobs in Slovakia. It's indeed to cope with extra production that's being put on in France, to cope with extra demand for those small French cars, and he said there won't be any jobs lost in Slovakia.
Dominic Hughes in Brussels, thanks very much. Well, our business editor, Robert Peston, is here for a little bit more. Robert, we've heard a lot about protectionism as a theory over recent weeks. Now it suddenly sounds much more real.
Well, there has been a manifestation of this in, lots of countries where one would hope, in a sense, they would know better. In America, for example, we had the Buy America policy. We've had a policy in America where banks in receipt of state aid have been told they can only employ Americans, not foreigners. Now, this, of course, seems to play well to the gallery, seems to go down well with local populations. The worry, of course, is that actually it's a beggar my neighbour policy. When individual economies, governments of individual economies say, right, we're going to favour domestic businesses, domestic employment, it may have a short-term benefit for their own countries, but actually over the long term, there is absolutely no doubt that the depressing impact it has on trade impoverishes all of us.
Robert, I'm going to take you back now for your thoughts on Northern Rock and this question of risky mortgages being lent out after it was taken over. How embarrassing is that for our government?
Well, there have been a whole series of criticisms made by the National Audit Office, the watchdog, of the way, or the events leading up to the nationalisation that are embarrassing for Gordon Brown and indeed Alistair Darling, the Chancellor. The one that stood out for me was that in 2004 the Treasury was aware that it didn't have in place the appropriate procedures for dealing with a bank that ran into the sort of difficulties that Northern Rock then ran into. I'm afraid this doesn't look good for them, but I'm afraid it is symptomatic of, in a sense, a much bigger mistake which Gordon Brown made, which the Chancellor made, which the US authorities made, President Bush made. They were all just ludicrously optimistic about what was going on in the banking system. They thought that the extraordinary growth in bank lending was good for the world. It turned out to have been absolutely appallingly dangerous for all of this. So in a way, the Northern Rock criticisms are simply a sort of small example of the really big charge you can make against the people who were running the world at that time.
Robert, thanks. Our business editor, Robert Peston. There's more bad news for the car industry today.